Milo's at that age where baby teeth fall out of kids' heads like ripe fruit from their boughs. A few months ago, he lost 2 teeth in the middle of baseball practice, a lateral incisor and a molar. Both times, he sprinted over to my seat on the bleachers, smile bright and chin smudged with dirt, waving the teeth around for all the parents to see. That night, I slipped into his room with a few dollars in a plastic bag. My kids don't believe in the tooth fairy, never have. But who doesn't enjoy a tradition that involves waking up to cash? I approached his bed and gently stuck my hand under the pillow. But I failed to find the bag I made him put his teeth in. Not wanting to risk waking him up, I put the money under his pillow anyway, figuring he'd forgotten to place it. In the morning, he swore that he had put the teeth in a bag beneath his pillow and suggested that it may have fallen between the mattress and the headboard. That seemed like a reasonable explanation, but after dropping the kids off at school, I practically took apart his bed, and I still couldn't find the teeth. They weren't wedged beneath the mattress. They hadn't fallen to the ground, nor had they slipped into a pillowcase. I was stumped. I could only hope that Milo had accidentally thrown the teeth away. The alternative was that they were lodged in some crevice in his bed frame, and I would find them browning and rotten months later. A few weeks ago, it happened again. In the midst of dinner, Milo suddenly went still. I locked eyes with him from across the table as he grimaced, grabbed a napkin, and spat a mouthful of half-masticated food into it. Peeking out from the mush was a shiny, white tooth. My husband, joking that Milo was bleeding us dry, reminded him to put the tooth under his pillow this time. Milo nodded, and yet, when I reprised my tooth fairy role, I was unable to redeem my previous failure. Again, I couldn't find the tooth. I remember standing there in the darkness of his room, considering the possibilities. Once was an understandable oversight. Twice meant that Milo was doing something with the teeth. Something that, for whatever reason, he didn't want me to know about. I looked away from the bed, scanning over the piles of clothes and toys on the floor. There was one particular pile in the corner of his room that I hadn't remembered seeing earlier in the day. I spent a long time staring at the amorphous lump of what was probably clothes hanging over his desk chair, then turned my attention back to Milo. From the faint light seeping in from the hallway, I could see that his eyes were wide open and focused directly on me. The sight made me start. I flinched a bit, apologized for waking him, and then said something about not being able to find the teeth. For a moment, I thought his attention moved to something behind me, something in the corner of the room. Then, he quietly asked me if we could talk in the morning. Feeling embarrassed and oddly unsettled, I obliged and left the room. I didn't get the chance to talk to Milo the next morning. His little sister fell ill, badly enough that I had to take the day off work, and by the time the chaos settled, the missing teeth had slipped to the back of my mind. Several days passed before I thought of them again. One night last week, as we were getting into bed, I finally told my husband everything about the teeth and about the creeping unease that had begun to color my conversations with Milo. My son was withholding something from me, and the longer it went unaddressed, the more concerned I grew. At first, my husband didn't share my worry. He laughed and suggested the tooth fairy might be real, stealing Milo's teeth before I could get to them. But his tone shifted when I mentioned the small changes I'd noticed in our son. Over the past few weeks, Milo had grown more reserved. He was still mostly cheerful, but there was a nervous energy beneath it, something restless and strained. I wondered if he was being picked on at school. He's always been a bit of teacher's pet, a fact I've long feared could make him a target. But I couldn't figure out how the missing teeth fit into that hypothesis. You know one thing I've noticed recently? My husband asked abruptly. He never asks for anything anymore. Candy, clothes, video games. He used to ask me to bump up his allowance every other week. Who knows? Maybe it's not bullying. Maybe it's just that he's starting to grow up. I remained unsatisfied by that explanation. Yesterday, it took me until dinner to realize that he was missing a central incisor. I hadn't even known it was loose. When I asked him when exactly he had lost a tooth, he merely shrugged, saying that it must have fallen out during lunch. Looking back, laid out like this, there was nothing inherently suspicious about the missing teeth. They could have been easily explained by childish carelessness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was so convinced of it that I stopped by Milo's school this afternoon, just as the kids were getting out. The ladies at the front desk weren't particularly thrilled by my unscheduled visit, but I guess I volunteered at enough PTA events that they let it slide. The secretary escorted me through the main doors and led me to Milo's classroom. By that point, most of the kids had filed out of the building and onto the field for pickup. The secretary returned to the front office, and I looked through the narrow, rectangular pane of glass in the door to ensure Milo's teacher, Mr. Haskett, was still there. He was still seated at his desk, looking exhausted. I watched as he opened a tin of Altoids on his desk and popped a mint into his mouth. He reclined in his chair and closed his eyes like he'd just taken a long drag of a cigarette. Amused, I opened the door slowly, trying not to startle him. As I stepped into the room, he gave me a look of surprise, which was quickly replaced by a wide smile. He greeted me by name and gestured for me to take a seat across from him. Papers crunched and the Altoids rattled in their tin as he quickly cleared the top of his desk, shoving everything in a drawer as I pulled up a chair. "I'm sorry to stop by so late," I said, sitting across from his desk. "I know the day is already over." "It's no trouble at all," Mr. Haskett said. "I'm glad you came by. Milo's one of my favorites." I smiled reflexively at that. "He's always enjoyed school. This year with you in particular," I said. "Lately, though, he's been a little inward, I suppose." Haskett nodded, listening. "I've noticed he's quieter," he said. "More independent. He gets his work done without prompting. Doesn't ask for much." "Ah, well, that's something my husband and I have noticed as well," I said. "I'm sure it sounds silly to complain about a child asking for less, but it's as if he's decided he doesn't need anything anymore." "Sometimes that's just part of growing up," he said. "Kids get to that age where they like to do things on their own. They don't want things handed to them." I considered that for a moment. So aside from him getting a little more stoic, you haven't noticed anything strange? No trouble with the other kids? "I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary," he said, his tone calm and confident. "Milo's a smart and kind boy, well liked by the other students." I nodded, unsure what else to say. We made small talk about school for a few more minutes. Then I thanked him for his time and stood, smoothing my skirt as I turned toward the door. That was when I noticed the cubbies along the far wall. Most were empty now, stripped down to forgotten mittens and stray worksheets. One wasn't. Milo's name was printed neatly on the label. Inside sat a pair of high-top sneakers that I recognized instantly. A few weeks earlier, we'd been shopping together for new winter clothes. Milo had stopped short in front of store window and pressed his hands to the glass, pointing them out excitedly. I told him they were too expensive, and he had nodded and let it go. His disappointment folded away so neatly it had almost hurt to watch. "Those shoes," I said, pointing. "Have you seen Milo wearing those shoes?" Haskett glanced over, then shrugged. "Not sure. Why do you ask?" "I didn't buy those for him." "They're probably in the wrong cubby then," he said. "The kids mix things up all the time." "But why are they in someone's cubby and not, on their feet?" He laughed lightly. "Couldn't tell you. But don't worry. I'm sure they'll find their way back to whoever they belong to." As he spoke, he began gathering his things, packing his back with practiced efficiency. The message was clear enough. That was my cue to leave. Still, I lingered a moment longer. "Before I go," I said, gesturing toward his desk, "would you mind if I stole a mint?" He paused. When he looked up at me, he gave me a wide smile, strikingly white and entirely humorless. "Sorry," he said. "I'm all out. I'm posting here because I don't know who else to ask. I work in museum collections. Most of my job involves stabilizing items and not opening them. I had received a journal a while back. It was cataloged as an unidentified personal notebook, early 20th century, stored with a group of trench maps and ration logs recovered during a private estate donation. No name, no notes beyond found among effects. The binding is hand-stitched, leather overboard, warped slightly as if it had been damp and dried several times. All of our testing says it isn't a fake. The paper, ink, stitching, and we're all date to 1914. Nothing we can find suggests later alteration, which is why this is so strange. It came onto my radar because a graduate student needed primary material for a project. They gave me grounds to request a non-invasive scan, angled light, multispectral imaging, so the contents could be transcribed without destroying the spine. I expected either something mundane or a clever fake. After reading the first transcript, though, I expected a novelty or a counterfeit. The language inside felt wrong. You'll know what I mean when you read it. In disbelief, I consulted the test results and put requests in for more, but they all said the same thing. All of our testing says it's authentic. Every test we ran placed the materials firmly in 1914. Ink, paper, stitching, all consistent. No signs of later alteration. The content, however, is confusing. What follows is a transcription of the writing recovered from the initial scan. I've transcribed what the scans revealed as faithfully as possible so far. I haven't corrected language or smoothed inconsistencies. I'm hoping someone here might recognize something I'm missing. This is the first entry. I've asked for another scan to retrieve material deeper in the page stack, but it will take a few days to get the results. This is what I have for now. As soon as I'm healed up, I'm going straight to my unit commander and letting him have it. This has been by far the most dangerous and unprofessional troop I've ever seen. Before anyone reads this and assumes I'm confused, I should explain how it normally works. War reenactments, just like real war, aren't about motion so much as position. You don't charge and run around shooting your gun endlessly. You hold. You wait. You go over the trench when you're told, and you come back when the whistle blows. It is meticulously rehearsed. The ground is measured. Even the mud is familiar after a while. You know where you're supposed to be. We were reenacting the Ardennes, 1914. That was the hook this year. August 21st, anniversary of first contact. Everyone was excited about it in a way I usually find tiresome. Early war is messy, poorly documented, and full of mistakes people like to romanticize after the fact. Still, the organizers had done their homework. Dense forest, uneven ground, limited sightlines. The real selling point, though, was the eclipse. Total solar eclipse, scheduled to pass over the region mid-morning. Same date as the original engagement. Rare alignment. Once-in-a-lifetime kind of thing. They'd advertised it heavily. History under the same sky. That sort of language. We'd been rehearsing the battle for weeks. First we'd hump through the woods, emerge onto a plain where a trench had been dug in front of an open recreation of no man's land. That is where the true battle begins, and the audience would be waiting for us to emerge from the forest. My unit always takes the same section of trench. There's a timber brace halfway down with a crack that looks like a lightning bolt. That's my marker. When we go over, I count the steps from there. We get about halfway into the charge when the eclipse is supposed to reach totality. We were all meant to pause and let everyone take it in, and then when the darkness began to break, a German barrage would commence to startle everyone back. It was quite good theatrics, in my opinion. I'd recently been reassigned to a new troop with a great reputation, and I was looking forward to fitting myself into what they'd already built. They were known for their discipline, tight spacing, clean movement, and no wasted noise. They took the work seriously in the way I respect, not just dressing the part, but understanding the rhythm of it. I'd spent the week before watching recordings of their previous events, noting where they held too long and where they rushed. I adjusted my timing to match theirs, shortened my fall so it wouldn't draw focus, practiced keeping my face slack so the moment would read as finished instead of dramatic. Integration matters. One bad performance can pull the eye and ruin the whole field. I didn't want to stand out. I wanted to disappear the right way. When the day came, it went extremely well, and then it fell apart. We moved efficiently and convincingly, the way the French had in the opening hours of the real engagement, pushing through the forest in dense columns, because that was what doctrine demanded at the time. The Ardennes had always punished that kind of thinking. Trees too tight, ground too broken, visibility too poor, but that was the point of choosing it. Early war mistakes are easier to understand when you can feel them in your legs. We crossed a shallow stream meant to stand in for the Seymour's tributaries, boots sinking and slipping on the stones. I remember thinking they'd done well to include it. Men cursed quietly, rifles held high, line bunching and then stretching again as we climbed out. That sort of inconvenience sells everything else. The soundscape was handled better than I expected. Distant artillery, intermittent rather than constant, with long, quiet stretches in between. That matched the accounts. Short, violent barges followed by nothing at all, as if the forest itself had gone deaf. I noted it approvingly. Too many reenactments drowned the field in noise. War, especially at the beginning, is mostly waiting. By mid-morning, we were exactly where we were supposed to be. The light through the trees was steady, late summer bright, and morale, or what passes for it in these settings, was high. Men joked under their breath. Someone hummed. It all felt controlled, deliberate. Even the mistakes were the right kind. We made it to the trench just as the moon touched the edge of the sun. When the light began to go, it wasn't how I expected. Shadows sharpened, then thinned. Greens dulled. Faces lost contrast. The world looked flatter, simpler. We were still moving, and for a brief moment, no more than a breath, the Ardennes went utterly still, exactly as some of the men later claimed it had in 1914. Birds quiet. Wind gone. The colors drained away. Sound carried strangely. I remember being pleased. They timed it well. Someone laughed behind me. Someone else swore. The temperature dropped. I checked my footing, found my marker, and waited. For just a moment I felt the ground shake and settle, the way it does when a distant shell lands. The forest seemed to pull inward. Depth collapsed. Distance stopped making sense. I assumed it was adrenaline. People always underestimate how much the body feels and when the senses are disrupted. I tasted something bitter at the back of my throat and swallowed it down, convinced it was nerves. I'd felt it before, just not this strongly. Time slipped. I can't explain it better than that. Movements came in jerks rather than flows. A man would be in front of me, then suddenly ahead, then back again, as if the moments between hadn't quite resolved. I hadn't felt dizzy or sick the whole day. I don't know if it had to do with the eclipse, my nerves, or something else. I told myself this was just what stress did. This was the body narrowing its field, trimming excess information to keep you functional. If anything, it meant the reenactment was working. When the light returned, the barrage started, but things were all wrong. The barrage started too heavy. Somebody loaded the blanks with way too much gunpowder. They don't thud like that. They crack, they snap. These impacts had too much weight. The earth shook in a way that rattled my teeth. The smoke didn't drift. It pooled, thick and low, and when I breathed it in my chest burned like I'd swallowed something sharp. A casing spun near my boot and settled in the mud. It wasn't brass-colored the way the reenactment blanks were supposed to be. It was duller, darker. I remember thinking someone had mixed batches again. I added Danny the munitions, guy to my list of people I was going to have strong words with. I'd expected much more out of this new assignment, and to say I was disappointed was an understatement. Someone shouted a warning, but it wasn't one of the calls we practiced. Again, a terrible decision. There was no room for improv in this line of work. The illusion is fragile and must be held with all precision. This troop did not have that. The words blurred together, swallowed by the noise. I was so annoyed that the timing was off, that the organizers had let the spectacle get away from them. We made it to the trench for the charge. Our commander gave the stand by order. Then the charge. We climbed the ladders and went over, and immediately the spacing fell apart. Men dropped too early. Others didn't drop at all. Someone was screaming with way too much gusto. This had to be a rookie, because he just let go as if he couldn't stop himself. It wasn't the right kind of scream, the kind people think of when they imagine pain. It went on too long without breaking, stayed too high, too loud. Real fear, if it's done right, stutters. It catches in the throat. You hear it fall apart as the lungs empty. This one didn't do that. It just poured out of him, raw and undisciplined, like he hadn't practiced holding anything back. I remember thinking he should have cut it short, Let the noise taper. Save something for the next pass. When he finally went hoarse, it sounded forced, like he was chasing an effect instead of letting it happen. I looked away, irritated. Overacting ruins the illusion. As I moved past the amateur, I noticed a man down in the mud a few yards over, both hands locked around his thigh, the rest of his destroyed leg strewn a few yards away. Fake blood was gushing from his leg, and I could see bone shards sticking out. It wasn't the most convincing prosthesis job I'd seen, but nonetheless I'd believe it 10 feet away squinting. I was curious, so I got down next to him and found he really didn't have a leg. I didn't know they'd started bringing amputees into the roster, but once the idea occurred to me, I had to admit I was impressed. Someone already missing a leg saves you half the work. You don't have to fake the movement of it. Don't have to choreograph the awkward fall or worry about the illusion breaking when the body lands wrong. The hard part is concealment before the event, long trousers, careful movement, keeping spectators from noticing the imbalance. If they'd managed that, it spoke well of the organizers. I gave him a quick slap on the shoulder, half encouragement, half acknowledgement. By then I'd started to lose interest in maintaining the illusion myself. The whole thing was going badly enough that a small break in character didn't seem like it would matter. Letting him know he was doing solid work felt like the right thing to do. I tried engaging him, but he was so committed to the role, he just suppressed a scream and yelled at me to drag him back to the trench. That brought me back to the reality of the situation, and I remembered I was still acting. I again patted his shoulder and told him my part was to keep going. I left him yelling curses at me, very committed to the part, but I couldn't indulge him. I had lost my place, and I didn't want to leave the man assigned to kill me hanging. Just because everyone else wasn't doing their parts right doesn't mean I shouldn't. I remember thinking I should find him afterward. A performance like that shouldn't be wasted on a sloppy unit like this. If he could keep that level of control under pressure, he'd fit in well with my troupe. I found my next mark and I moved forward. I counted my steps. I found my place in the churned earth where the earth hole dips just enough to cradle a body. That's where I die. I stood there longer than I should have. The noise kept going. The barrage didn't pause. I remember feeling exposed, upright while everything else collapsed around me. I wondered if the whistle had failed. I waited. Nothing hit me. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I'd missed my cue, that I'd drifted out of position during the push and my shooter had passed me by, hunting for someone else. I was calculating how long I could stand there before I broke the illusion, already convinced it had been too long, that someone had noticed me upright in the open like an idiot. Then a German infantryman stepped out of the smoke. It was so sudden and so clean it felt incredible. He appeared as if summoned, rifle already rising, and for a moment the symmetry of it struck me. I nearly smiled. For everything that went wrong in this reenactment, I finally felt this would be a worthy end to my performance. I gripped the tether of the blood bladder on my chest, bracing myself to do it properly. He didn't hesitate. The shot hit me hard enough that the world collapsed inward. The ground rushed up and knocked the breath out of me in a single violent motion, and everything went black before I could understand what had gone wrong. The next thing I remember clearly is waking up in a tent with a burning sensation in my chest, my shoulder bandaged and my arm in a sling. In that moment I put together that the live ammunition they were using had made it into the German's rifle, and he had actually shot me. But if that is true, I shouldn't be in a field hospital. I didn't even know we had a replica field hospital, and this was an odd way to stage it to boot. The canvas walls were fully closed. No sight lines. No access for spectators. What was the point of a medical display no one could see? I was still deciding which part of this to be angriest about when a man came in wearing a uniform I didn't recognize and started asking me questions that didn't make sense. I told him there'd been an accident. I said someone had used live rounds. I told him I needed to be moved to a real hospital, not whatever this was supposed to be. He told me I was in one, the best they could do. That's when I really lost my temper. I told him to stop playing along. I told him this wasn't an immersive theater and people could get killed by indulging it. I demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. He didn't argue. He just wrote something down and said he'd be back. That was some time ago. I don't know how long. I'm writing this so I have a record of my grievances, but also to pass the time. Someone will come back and explain where the mistake was made. Someone will admit they let the realism go too far. They always pull the curtain back eventually. As the title says, I and my friend got lost in Massachusetts. We're both MIT students and have known each other since freshman year of high school. I'm going into a shit ton of majors and minors, and he's going into mathematics with a major in physics. We're both in this college because we worked our asses off and gained a bunch of scholarships from all around the country, the one thing decent in America, and we're not planning on dropping out, especially the companion in this story. We'll call him T. T is a stubborn lad, loves music, hates everyone but his friends, and would rather die than vote. He's a staggering 5 feet 9 inches, black, and he never backs down from a fight. He's won so many bar fights he could have won the WWE Championship without competing in it. In summary, T kicks ass. Now let's look at me. I'm 6 feet 2 inches, Asian male, dyed green hair, love cars, and would rather die than be in a fight. Despite my height, I'm not muscular, and I'd rather spend my days rotting away in the chess hall than be in an argument. I'm the virgin, T is the jigga-chad. So we're on our way to this lovely vacation spot on the outskirts of Massachusetts. We're on the highway, and we're pulling into the far right lane to go into the next exit. T is looking at the GPS and tells me to turn onto exit 60. I look at him for a moment. I've never heard of exit 60. Says it right here on the GPS. T said, should be coming up now. I look forward, and lo and behold, there it is, exit 60. I felt strange in that moment. Why have I never seen this before? Before that moment, I had never seen an exit 60 on this highway. But I listened to the short king in the passenger seat and turned onto exit 60, which curved down into a thick pine forest. For several miles, we traveled along the road past exit 60, surrounded by the tall pines lining the road. It wasn't until about 4 to 7 miles into the road that I noticed something. We hadn't passed nor come up to a single car. Weirdest of all, T hadn't said a single word in several minutes. I glanced over to check on my friend. T was pale, his eyes glued to his GPS screen, and his hands shaking. I looked at him in surprise. You okay, dude? You don't look too well. You need me to pull over? T slowly looked at me, and then slowly lifted his GPS so I could see the screen. My jaw dropped. Our road wasn't on the map. According to the GPS, we were driving straight through solid green. I quickly pulled over the car and grabbed T's GPS. This isn't right, I said. There should be road here. No shit, Sherlock, T said, panicking. The road just disappeared from the GPS. What about the exit we took? Is that still there? I scrolled towards the highway we exited from, and I almost dropped the GPS. Exit 60 was gone. There was nothing there. I wasted no time. I yanked on my Lincoln's automatic and flew the car into reverse, whipping around and careening the opposite direction. I remember thinking that there was no way exit 60, and the road we're driving on didn't exist. Maybe the GPS was busted and exit 60 did exist. We drove 2 miles, 4 miles, 5 miles, 6 miles, 1 more mile until the truth. 7 miles, 8 miles. I stomped on the brakes and flung us both forward. What the fuck, D? T shouted. I could have gotten a goddamn concussion. What the hell is wrong? SHHHH, I said, look. The highway was gone, and with my guidance T noticed it too. T cursed under his breath. Did you take a wrong turn? T asked. I looked at him and shook my head. The road was straight for as far as the eye could see. No turns, no curves, just straight road. Where's the highway then? T asked, panicking more. I have no goddamn idea, I said as I took out the GPS. This was getting too weird. According to the GPS, there was no highway. It was just a blob of green now. We're lost, aren't we? T said, huffing. Hold on now, I began. Maybe we did take a wrong turn. Let's go forward and see where this takes us. We drove for hours along the road. Nothing but pines and asphalt for miles. That's when I noticed my gas gauge wasn't moving. With how much we were driving, we should have gotten about halfway through the tank. but the needle was still at about 80% gas. I thought the needle was broken, maybe an error with the system. But then I remembered I got my car checked out 3 days before we began this trip. How could the mechanic have not seen the gauge needle broken? Did you hear that? T suddenly spoke up. No, I replied, confused. T always had good ears. No matter how hard you sideswiped him, his hearing remained keen. He always wore protection earmuffs in the labs and never had his music too loud. Sounded like a thump. T said, "You sure your car is good?" "Definitely," I replied. "Got it checked out a few days ago before the trip." I heard a thumping noise. It sounded echoey, like it wasn't from the car but from outside. The trees looked taller now, but that had to be from my perception changed by exhaustion. "Dude, do the trees look bigger to you?" I questioned, still driving. "Yeah, that's weird as hell." "So it's not just me then." "Great." The thumping noise came back, this time louder, and it began appearing rhythmically, like drums or footsteps. "Dude, I think the car is out of whack." "Drive." "What?" I asked, confused. "Drive. Now," T replied, practically yelling at me. The thumps were getting faster and louder. I happened to look in my rearview mirror at that moment. My heart stopped for a second. Something was behind us, but we couldn't make it out. It was huge, indescribable, and approaching fast. I wasted no more time. I drove my foot into the gas pedal and sped down the road. I don't remember much after seeing that thing, but I remember enough. Screaming, T crying. At one point that monster got so close we could hear its roaring cries that sounded like slowed baby wails. My car was speeding down the road at top speed, but it didn't feel like enough. I remember screaming at my car to go faster, and I remember T starting to snot cry. The first time that man ever did in his life. I felt like I was going to die. Suddenly, in the far distance, we saw it. An upwards curve in the road. I remember how I pointed it out and almost dropped speed from how relieved I was. T was crying for me to speed up, and I remember screaming back that we were going to make it. That thing was still behind us, and its roars grew much louder, and its thumps more desperate. It was closing the gap fast. Then the thumps stopped. The roars stopped. It was so sudden it was like someone just paused the video. I looked in my rearview mirror. The monster was gone. Completely gone without a trace. The curve was just a quarter of a mile away, and I managed to slow down in order to make the turn. Just like that, we were back on the highway. We skidded to a stop on the side of the highway. It was a miracle no one hit us when we entered. Me and T sat there for what felt like hours, panting and looking at each other. Suddenly, T smiled. "Holy shit, dude," he said, panting. "What the hell just happened?" Out of nowhere, I began chuckling. I have no clue. We both began laughing, relieved to have escaped whatever the hell we just went through. We stopped laughing after a bit, and I was preparing to restart the car when a state patrol officer pulled over in front of us and got out of his car, approaching us. I rolled down my window as he stopped at it. "You two kids all right?" The officer inquired with a strange, thick Australian accent. "You look like you've just seen Satan himself." "Officer," I said, "you have no idea. Saw you pulled over and thought you needed some assistance. Need a lift." "We're good, officer," I replied. "You know where the nearest motel is?" The officer pointed down the highway. "Just a few miles down air and take a left at the intersection." "Thanks." "No problem." The officer walked back to his patrol car. As stepped inside, I noticed something. His car's patrol number. Massachusetts State Patrol Number 060. I will never truly understand what happened that day, nor will I ever really explain the chills I got from seeing that patrol number. But I can explain this. Never drive down an exit you don't remember being on a highway, especially if it's labeled Exit 60. My mother's death didn't feel real until I unlocked the front door of my childhood home, and the smell hit me all at once. Old dust, pine cleaner, and something sweeter beneath it that I couldn't place. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting without changing, the way houses do when they've outlived the people who loved them. My dad stood behind me while I fumbled with the lock. his hands folded loosely at his waist, posture relaxed, patient. He looked exactly the same as he always had. Older, yes, grayer at the temples, but intact in a way that felt unfair considering the funeral we just buried my mother in. He hugged me when I stepped inside, firm and warm and entirely convincing. I remember thinking, stupidly, that if there were ever signs something had been wrong with him, they would have shown themselves by now. He'd been a good father, attentive, creative. He made things with his hands. He remembered birthdays. He read to me when I was little. These were the thoughts I clung to in the early days, before I started remembering the toys. The house was quieter without my mom. Not emptier, just wrong. Her things were still everywhere, but they'd already begun to feel like props left behind after a play had closed. My dad told me to take my time, said I could stay as long as I needed while we sorted things out. He mentioned my old room, said it was mostly untouched. When I asked him casually if he kept any of my toys, he smiled in that familiar, indulgent way and told me they were still in my toy box, same place they'd always been. There was something about the way he said it that lingered with me, though at the time I couldn't have told you why. My childhood bedroom looked smaller than I remembered. The posters were gone, the shelves bare except for dust outlines where things used to sit, but the toy box was still there at the foot of the bed. I remember hesitating before opening it, not because I was afraid, but because grief has a way of making even neutral memories feel dangerous. Inside were the wooden action figures my dad had always made for me. Not store-bought toys, not plastic or soft or colorful, but carefully carved figures with jointed limbs and tiny cloth clothes stitched by hand. Knights, soldiers, travelers, figures that looked like they belonged to some older story. My mom used to say they were charming. I used to agree. I lifted them out one by one and set them on the floor. They were heavier than I remembered. Each of them had the same strange symbol carved into their chests beneath their clothes, something I'd noticed as a kid but never questioned. A triangle, lines drawn from each edge inward, converging into a circle marked with an X. As a child, I'd assumed it was just my dad's signature, the way artists signed their work. Seeing it again made my stomach tighten for reasons I couldn't articulate. My favorite was missing, though. The knight with the javelin had been my constant companion for years. I used to carry him everywhere, even slept with him under my pillow until my mom insisted he'd ripped the bed sheets. I found him eventually, shoved into the back of my closet beneath a pile of old coats. He was different. The wooden javelin was driven straight through his chest, embedded deep enough that the point protruded from his back. His hands were still wrapped around the shaft, fingers carved into the shape of desperate grip, angled inward as if he'd done it himself. I stood there for a long time holding him, waiting for the sense of wrongness to resolve into something manageable. I tried to tell myself it was damage, something I'd done as a kid and forgotten, but I knew I hadn't. The carving was too precise. The force implied by the depth of the wound was impossible. When I pressed my thumb against the wood near the hole, it felt warmer than the rest of him. That night, I woke to a sound I didn't recognize at first. Not a crash exactly, more like weight being released all at once. Wood against wood, then against the floor. It came from my bedroom, a dense, unified clatter that had no stagger to it, no echoing sequence. Just one moment of impact, as if something had been let go. I lay still for several seconds, listening for footsteps or my dad's voice, for any sign that someone else had heard it too. The house remained silent. When I finally sat up and turned on the lamp, the light revealed the shelf above my dresser, completely bare. Every wooden figure lay on the floor below it, scattered outward in a rough semicircle. None of them were stacked or tangled. They hadn't fallen into each other. They'd landed apart, spaced in a way that felt deliberate, though I couldn't have explained how. I picked one up and checked the shelf with my hand, running my fingers along the wood. It wasn't warped. It wasn't loose. I pressed down on it harder than necessary, half expecting it to give or crack or prove my dad right before he'd even said anything. It held firm. When I set the figure back upright on the dresser, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Its head was angled slightly upward, not enough to be obvious, but enough that its carved eyes were no longer facing the wall where the shelf had been. They were pointed toward the bed. I told myself that was coincidence, that gravity, vibration, and my own exhaustion were enough to explain it. I put the rest of the toys back without looking at their faces, turned off the lamp, and lay there until morning with the blanket pulled up to my chin like I was 10 years old again. Nothing else happened that night. Nothing moved. My dad was already up when I came into the kitchen. He stood at the stove in an old t-shirt and slippers, cracking eggs into a pan like he'd done 1,000 mornings before. The radio played softly on the counter, some local station talking about traffic. For a moment, watching him from the doorway, it was easy to believe the night had been nothing more than a bad dream layered over grief. "Morning," he said without turning around. "You sleep okay?" "Not really," I said. I sat at the table and rubbed my eyes. "Did you hear anything last night?" He glanced over his shoulder, eyebrows lifting just a little. "Like what?" "A noise. It was like the middle of the night in my room." He turned the burner down before answering. "House is old, it settles at night, especially when the temperature drops." All of my toys fell off the shelf. That made him pause, just long enough to notice, but not long enough to feel intentional. He resumed stirring the eggs, scraping the pan with slow, even movements. "Did they break?" "No." "That's good. I made them pretty solid." I didn't respond right away. He slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of me, along with 2 slices of toast. He always did that, fed people first. "They all fell at once," I said finally. He sat across from me and took a sip of his coffee. "That happens, weight shifts. Wood expands. Kind of feels like magic, doesn't it?" I watched his face as he spoke, looking for something I could point to later and say that's when it started. There wasn't anything. He looked tired, sad. Sad in the way people get after funerals when they're finally allowed to stop being strong. I was thinking about those toys. "You kept all of them?" "Of course I did, why wouldn't I?" "I don't know. Just figured maybe some of them got thrown out over the years." He shook his head, almost smiling. "You don't throw things like that away. Not things that still have a reason." "What reason?" I asked. He looked at me then, really looked at me, like he was weighing whether the question deserved an answer. "Memories," he said after a moment. "Some things are worth keeping close. They help you remember what matters." I laughed before I could stop myself. It came out wrong, too sharp. "You always did talk like that." He smiled back, unbothered. "I've always believed you should live with the results of things. Otherwise they don't mean much." I stared down at my plate. The eggs had gone cold. "Did you move anything in my room after I went to sleep?" "No, I didn't go in there." "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I wouldn't touch your things without asking. Never have." That was true. He'd always been careful about that, respectful even of his own kids' property. It was one of the things I loved about him. As I stood to take my plate to the sink, he added casually, "If you're going through the toy box, try not to mix them up too much. They were all made a certain way." I paused with my back to him. "What do you mean?" "Just that they fit where they fit," he said. "Things tend to get uncomfortable when they're moved around too much." I waited for him to say more. He didn't. He went back to see his coffee, and the radio kept talking about traffic, and for a few seconds everything felt almost normal again. It wasn't until later, when I noticed the same strange symbol carved into the handle of a hammer in his workshop, that I realized how carefully he'd chosen every word. I tried to be rational about it at first. Grief does strange things to memory, and memory does worse things when given time alone in familiar places. Faces blur. Details rearrange themselves to fit narratives you don't realize you're building. That's what I told myself when I picked up the smaller wooden figure again, the one in the plain tunic, and felt that crawling sense of familiarity tighten in my chest. It wasn't an exact likeness. My dad hadn't carved portraits. The faces were simplified, smoothed down to essentials, cheekbones, brow, jaw. But the proportions were right in a way that felt intimate. The slight bend in the nose, the way the mouth slanted downward on one side, as if caught mid-thought, I carried the figure to the window and held it in better light, rotating it slowly, forcing myself to find differences. The more I looked, the fewer I found. Evan, the neighborhood kid who used to shove me into hedges and steal my bike when I was too small to stop him. He'd gone missing the summer I turned 11. People said he ran away. His parents moved not long after. I hadn't thought about him in years. I put the figure down harder than I meant to and backed away from the shelf. My heart was racing, not with fear exactly, but with the kind of adrenaline that comes when your mind is trying to outrun a conclusion it doesn't want to reach. I spent the rest of the morning avoiding the room. When my dad asked if I wanted to help him sort through the garage, I said yes too quickly. That was where I noticed the symbol again. It was carved into the wooden handle of a hammer hanging above the workbench. The same triangle, the same lines drawn inward, converging at that marked circle. It was faint, worn smooth by years of use, but unmistakable. I reached out and brushed dust from it with my thumb, and a wave of nausea rolled through me, so suddenly I had to grab the bench to stay upright. The world tilted, darkened at the edges, and for a second I was convinced I was going to be sick right there on the concrete floor. "You okay?" my dad asked from behind me. I nodded too fast. "Yeah, just stood up too quick." He didn't press it. He never did. That was another thing I'd always loved about him. I started noticing the symbol everywhere after that. On the handles of garden shears, etched faintly into the underside of a shelf bracket, burned into the corner of a cutting board my mom used to keep out on the counter. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It was consistent every time, precise in a way that ruled out coincidence. I tried to tell myself it was some old maker's mark, a habit he'd never broken, but the thought didn't hold. My dad wasn't sentimental like that. He didn't repeat himself without reason. That afternoon, I went back to the toys. I lined them up on the floor, farther apart this time, giving each one space. There were more of them than I remembered. Some I recognized immediately: the knight, the soldier with the cracked helmet, the woman in the long dress whose hands were carved folded in front of her chest. Others felt unfamiliar in a way that bothered me more. People I didn't remember, but somehow knew. The businessman was the worst. He wore a carved suit jacket with real buttons sewn into it, tiny and functional. His hair was neatly parted, his posture rigid. When I lifted him, I noticed a faint indentation around his neck, like a collar pressed too tight for too long. I knew who he was before I let myself say it. My dad's former boss. The man who used to come over for dinner sometimes, who laughed too loudly and never remembered my name. He'd been found dead in his office years ago. Heart attack, they said. Stress. I dropped the figure and backed away until I hit the bed. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Every face I could place belonged to someone who had wronged my father in some small or significant way. A contractor who'd overcharged him and scammed him because he was the only contractor in the area. A neighbor who'd threatened to sue over a property line. People who had disappeared, died suddenly, or simply stopped being talked about. People who had, until now, only existed as half-remembered stories. That night, I took the knight down from the shelf again. I don't know why I chose him. Maybe because he'd always been my favorite. Maybe because the spear through his chest felt like an accusation I couldn't answer. I sat on the edge of the bed and turned him over in my hands, tracing the carving marks, the tiny imperfections left by my dad's tools. The symbol was there beneath his tunic, deeper than on the others, the lines pressed so hard they'd split the grain. On impulse, I lifted the knight's head and pressed his mouth to my ear. At first, there was nothing, just the faint smell of old wood and dust. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, I heard something that might have been breath, a sound too soft to be sound, more like pressure. I held still, afraid that even the act of listening might make it stop. The noise shifted, tightened, and then I understood what it was. Screaming. Not loud, not clear, muffled and distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. Pain stretched thin and folded in on itself, endless and trapped. My hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped him. When I pulled him away, the sound stopped instantly, leaving the room unbearably silent. I put the knight back where I'd found him and didn't touch the toys again. Later, at dinner, My dad asked me if I'd slept any better. I told him I had. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to eating like nothing in the world had changed. I watched him chew, watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, and wondered how many people were still screaming in the quiet spaces of this house. That night, I dreamed of wood splitting under pressure, of hands clawing at the inside of something that would never open. I didn't go looking for anything else. I want that to be clear. I wasn't brave enough for that, or noble, or driven by any sense of obligation to the people I'd come to understand were trapped in my childhood toys. Why I was, more than anything, was unable to sit still with what I knew. Once you accept a truth like that, even partially, the world rearranges itself around it. Every familiar thing becomes suspect. Every quiet moment stretches too long. The house had a way of guiding me without asking. I'd find myself standing in doorways I didn't remember walking to, staring at corners I'd passed 1,000 times without noticing. The backyard was one of those places. I hadn't been out there since I arrived. Not really. It was late afternoon when I stepped outside, the light thin and pale, the grass dry from weeks without rain. The far edge of the yard sloped gently downward toward a line of trees. There was nothing remarkable about it. No shed, no fence, no marker of any kind. Just a stretch of ground my dad kept meticulously neat, even now. I don't know what made me walk that way. Maybe it was the way the sod looked slightly newer there, greener in a patch that didn't match the rest. Maybe it was just the accumulated weight of everything else. I knelt and brushed my hand over the grass. The soil beneath felt firmer than it should have. When I pushed harder, my fingers struck something solid. The trap door was almost invisible. A square of concrete fitted so tightly into the ground it looked like part of the earth itself. It took real effort to lift it, my fingers slipping against the edge until I managed to wedge them underneath. As the door swung open, a smell rose up to meet me, cold, mineral, and layered with something darker beneath it. I gagged and had to turn my head away. A narrow set of steps led down into a small concrete room. No lights, no windows, just a single object at the center of the space. The altar was made of ebony wood, polished to a dull sheen that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was scarred with cuts and burns, its surface pitted in places like it had been worked over again and again. Around it lay remnants I didn't want to catalog but did anyway. Clumps of hair caught in the corners, gray ash ground into the concrete, scraps of leather stiff with age, thread tangled and knotted like something abandoned mid-task. There were stains too, dark and uneven, soaked deep enough into the floor that no amount of scrubbing could have removed them. I stepped inside despite every instinct screaming at me not to. The symbol was carved into the altar's surface, larger and deeper than anywhere else I'd seen it. Dust filled the grooves, softening the lines. I crouched and brushed it away with shaking hands, revealing the triangle, the converging lines, the marked circle at the center. The moment the last of the dust cleared, my stomach lurched violently. Pain bloomed behind my eyes, sharp and disorienting, and the room seemed to fold inward on itself. I remember thinking that this must be what severe vertigo feels like. Then I was on the floor. The concrete was cold against my cheek. My mouth tasted like metal. For a few seconds, maybe longer, I couldn't tell if I'd lost consciousness or if time had simply skipped. When I pushed myself up, my hands came away damp with sweat. My heart was hammering so hard I could see my pulse in my wrists. Nothing else had happened. No voices, no visions, no answers. Just a body reacting to something my mind couldn't comprehend. I closed the trap door and replaced the sod as carefully as I could, like a child trying to erase evidence of a mistake. When I went back inside, my dad was in the living room watching television. He looked up and smiled. "You disappear on me? Just needed some air." He nodded, accepting it without question. "Dinner's in an hour." That night, I lay awake listening to the house, not for footsteps or movement, but for the absence of it. The toys didn't fall again. Nothing shifted. The silence was complete, and in that silence, I understood something that hurt worse than fear. He was never going to explain it. There would be no confession, no confrontation, no moment where I could demand names or reasons or mercy. Whatever he had done, whatever rules governed it. He had folded it so completely into the fabric of his life that it had become invisible to him. He loved me. I believe that. He loved me enough to keep me separate from it, to give me toys instead of truth, to let me grow up surrounded by suffering I was never meant to recognize. In the morning, I packed my things. My dad helped me load the car, moving carefully, deliberately, the way he always did. When I hugged him goodbye, his arms were steady around me, solid, human. He told me to drive safe. He told me to call when I got home. He stood in the driveway and waved until I was out of sight. I didn't take any of the toys with me. I think about them often now, lined up on shelves and in boxes, waiting in a house that still smells faintly of pine cleaner and dust. I think about the people they used to be, about the pain of existing inside something that cannot die. I think about the night most of all, and how he must have realized what he was long before I did, and had tried to do something about it. Sometimes I wonder if leaving him behind was a mercy. Sometimes I wonder if it was just another way of pretending I didn't know. It was the summer of 25, and me and my friend, both girls, 18 and 19, live in a small city in Latvia, the area which my friend lives and has a low population, and there isn't much around. The area is surrounded by forests, lakes, and fields. It's a semi-rural area with one small shop, with mostly old buildings. My friend lives in an apartment complex, which is a really old house that was used as sleeping quarters for Baron's servants. Right next is a small castle-like building, which is now a school, but used to be lived in by the Baron. This summer I was staying at my friend's place, and we got into a habit of late-night walks which lasted up into the early hours, between 3 to 5 a.m. At first these were just casual walks, and us goofing around just talking and listening to music, until one night we started to get a really uneasy feeling on our walks. We felt like there was another presence around watching our every move like hawks, with most of the area being pitch black, as there were barely any lanterns around. We couldn't really see much. On this one particular night, we started being accompanied by an orange cat. This orange cat, who we jokingly named Alfred, seemed to know exactly when we would start our late-night walks, and would be waiting for us outside her door, and would only appear at night, and with the area being so small we would have seen the cat before. Alfred would accompany us and follow our every step, which would have been something we just brushed off if it wasn't for the fact that he would always keep his eyes on something or someone, and would follow it around to every direction it moved. He would sit in front of us almost like he was trying to protect us or warn us about some sort of presence, which we strongly felt. Alfred staring into the dark distance terrified us, but we tried to brush it off as him maybe watching mice, since there is a lot of big open fields, but the uneasy feeling never left us. This one particular night the feeling of fear overwhelmed us, and we decided to head home earlier than usual. Walking back to our place, we started to notice a black silhouette behind the trees following us as we walked up a sidewalk, but we tried to ignore it and get home as fast as possible, thinking maybe our minds are just playing tricks on us out of fear and paranoia. Alfred stopped following us from where the apartment complex starts and couldn't take his eyes off of the silhouette, sitting in the middle of the road, staring into the deep darkness. The next day, I had made my way back to my own apartment, which is in a different area, about a few kilometers away, which is when the real horror started. It was late at night, and I was just chilling on my couch watching TV, when my friend texted me in a panic, terrified, telling me that something really weird is going on outside her window. It was around like 1:20 a.m. She lives on the first floor, and she had told me that her window is open while her blinds are closed. She started by telling me that she could hear footsteps walking, stomping, and running right under her window, but that's not the worst part, as she proceeded to tell me that it sounded like someone was right in her window, deliberately making really weird sounds with their mouth, which were really just gruesome and unexplainable and sounded really human. At first I thought these sounds had some explainable reason behind them, like it being the wind or some sort of stray animal, until I got to hear them myself the very next day. The next day I came over to stay at my friend's place again, as she was a little scared that it would happen again. As the day went on we totally forgot all about it, and even laughed about the sounds. Until later that night. We were just laying in bed scrolling on our phones, until we heard the unusual footsteps again, as if whatever or whoever was there wanted to be heard. The window was still open, by the way, as the summer was really hot. We glanced over at the window, slightly scared. We suddenly froze, as we came to a realization it was around the same time as last night. I even scrolled back to the messages to check what time my friend sent them. Then the sounds began. They were human-like, but wrong. Too close. It sounded as if someone had pressed their mouth directly against the window. Soft clicking noises. Tongue against teeth. Against the roof of the mouth. But wet. Slippery like saliva stretching and snapping. Like someone drowning and trying to breathe quietly. It wasn't just a noise. It felt intentional, as whatever was making it knew we were listening. It didn't sound human. More like something pretending to be. And this time I heard it too. Then in the middle of that terror we noticed something else. The blinds. They were no longer hanging straight. One section was pushed outward, bent away from the window, as if fingers were curled around it from the other side, holding it, testing it just enough to let us know we weren't alone, but not enough to be seen, just to let you know there was no wind, no animals, etc. After that we didn't dare to make a single sound or move a single muscle, as we were too scared to even let out a single breath. The air felt heavy, and then it happened. The noise. This time it came from inside in the hallway, right outside her bedroom door. We heard it crystal clear as the door was wide open. We shot up in a panic, wanted to be further from the door, but not closer to the window. We sighed in relief when we heard my friend's mum go to the bathroom, which we used as an opportunity to bolt out of my friend's bedroom and tell her mum. At first she looked slightly afraid, but then she went to the window in her room to check outside, as it's right next to my friend's. Then she proceeded to laugh and told us it's nothing there and not to worry, as she didn't see a thing outside. But we know for sure it wasn't our imagination. After calming down, we went to sleep. The next morning we woke up prepared. We spent the day researching ways to capture any evidence, as it has happened for the last 2 days. Sitting on the balcony having breakfast, we came up with the idea of using one of our phones to record the sound, and when the evening came we were sure we would get some proof. As the night approached, we obsessively checked the time, waiting for 1 a.m. to arrive. To our disbelief, nothing. If you had an explanation for this, we would be overjoyed and extremely grateful for extra opinions on this to ease our minds. I don't know if you'll ever see this, but here it is. The fire had grown, roaring away. The logs and branches we had tossed inside were snapping and popping as the fire consumed them. Its warmth kept the cold at bay, melting the matted down snow around the fire pit. How long do we have to wait again? I asked, watching my hot dog roll in a slow circle on a wiener stick. My friend rolled his eyes from across the fire. 1 in the morning, dude. I told you already. He took a swig from his beer bottle. Most other college students spent their time partying and trying to get girls' numbers. But not us. We were going to find a ghost, apparently. Why, you getting tired already? He asked. I was, but he wasn't getting that satisfaction from me. No, but I am getting bored. Is this all we have to do? I asked. This was the lamest ghost ritual I had ever heard of. No drawing sigils or anything. You just had to sit around in the fucking boonies with your weenie stick. My friend sighed, giving a dejected look towards the fire. Yes, she needs to see our flame. It'll be like a beacon to her. She's lost out there somewhere. He muttered. Our professor had put the idea into his head, and now he wouldn't let it go. He had begged me to come with him. I like to pretend I had better things to do, but it would surely spice up what would have been another weekend of smoking dope and stinking up the dorm. Now I could at least do it outside. Then what? I asked. Do we talk to her? My friend sighed, shaking his head. We take her picture, and then we get rich from it, he said matter-of-factly. I laughed. That's it. We can't talk to her or anything. Ask her about the afterlife, or something? I waved a hand around a makeshift campsite. We didn't even bring a Ouija board or anything. Ted shook his head. I wasn't going to bring a Ouija board, dude. Bad mojo. We could get a demon to come through or something. I laughed again. What kind of ghost hunter are you? The kind that's going to get super rich. I might even let you have some of the profits. I snorted, digging into my pocket. I only had 2 joints left, and would have smoked both of them myself. But today I was feeling generous. Here, I said, tossing it over. How did she die again, drowning? Ted nodded, catching the joint as I lit mine. There's that creek that runs through here. She was super crazy back in the day, apparently. A fucking serial killer. It was the only thing I had ever paid attention to in the old codgers class. The lady had been a settler back in the day, living in the very woods we were in. Her husband had been a trapper, selling furs for hats. The wife was a recluse, rarely showing her face to the small town Fernsworth had been. This hadn't done anything for her reputation, and people had started referring to her as what is now a proper bitch. Despite this, the husband was a kind man, and they lived happily for a time. Then one particularly brutal winter had brought mountains of snow with it. The couple had been trapped deep in the woods, in their squat cabin. This had broken the woman's mind. When the snow finally melted, some townspeople had made their way to the cabin. They had found the woman, dressed in her husband's clothes. The skin of his face had been turned into a mask, and she wore it, her eyes wild beneath it. The townspeople had tried to run, but in their panic failed to notice the traps left behind. One man had been caught in a bear trap, his legs severed in two. The other man had run into a snare trap, not designed for rabbits, but for people. He had struggled and flailed as he watched the woman approach him with a bloody hatchet. When the men had never come back, more townspeople went in their wake. They had found a grisly scene. The woman, being broken by cabin fever, had been eating the men, their limbs laying scattered on the forest floor. Upon being found, she let out a banshee-like scream and fled into the trees, before plunging into a nearby stream that had swallowed her whole. They hadn't looked for the body. Now the legend claimed if you sat around a campfire in the woods, you could see her or hear her. The last of the details fizzled in my mind as I puffed away on my joint, the haze fogging my mind. Ted looked at his phone, the bright screen making his eyes squint. 15 more minutes, then it happens. I could hear the anticipation in his voice. 15 minutes passed, and nothing happened. My eyes kept trying to close, and my joint had burned down to its end. All right, man, we tried. Can we go now? I asked. Ted sighed. We got lied to, man. I feel like a fish right now. I waved my hand, not bothering to say I told you so. Instead, I kicked snow onto the fire. We were walking away when Ted turned suddenly. What? I asked him. He stood still, hands at his sides. I felt my heart beat faster, the blood beating away the sludge of the weed. The fuck's the matter with you? I tugged on his arm, but he shook me off. Sounds so beautiful, he muttered. He was fucking with me, desperate to make something of the night. I turned around and started walking away, expecting him to yell boo or something behind me. Instead, he ran into the woods. His footsteps faded into the darkness. I whirled around, watching him disappear into the shadows. Ted, what the fuck? I yelled. Like a coward, I froze for a good 30 seconds. Then I sprinted after him, fumbling my phone from my pocket. I swore as my cold fingers turned on the flashlight and then dropped the phone. Hurriedly picking it up from the snow, I ran in what I thought was the right direction. Ted, I shouted. Come on, dude, this isn't funny. My voice shook. Footsteps plunged further into the dark trees. I ran in their direction, slamming into the bark of a tree and down into the snow. The cold seeped in, chilling me. Quickly scrambling to my feet, I plunged further into the woods, until I ran right into Ted. It was like hitting a brick wall. My head ached. As I looked up, he was gone by the time I gathered myself, the void swallowing him whole. Ted, come back, I screamed. Terror shook me as I pushed through ever-deepening snow. The trees stared down at me as I passed by, their frozen limbs like crooked fingers. All of them pointed deeper into the woods. Somehow I found Ted again. He stood at the bank of a frozen stream. The one in the story. I had no doubt in my mind. He swayed, his eyes vacant as he stared down at it. Ted, please, come back, we're lost. We could die out here, dude. I pulled on his arm to no avail. His feet were frozen to the ground. Can you hear it, Ian? He asked. I stopped tugging, only managing to shake my head. She has such a nice voice, listen. His arm moved faster than I thought possible, grabbing me by the back of my neck. Panicking, I struggled, trying to pry his fingers off me. But he had an iron grip. "Let go." I screamed into his ear, beating and flailing against him, all to no avail. That was when the song seeped into my ears. There were no words, only whistling. Ted was right, it was beautiful. Like the most heavenly bird song you'd ever heard. It rooted itself into my brain, and I stopped struggling. My light shone across the frozen surface on the ice. Something was moving underneath it. There were hands, so many of them. Some beckoned, and some beat on the ice. My mouth was dry, and my mind folded in on itself. Ted moved, his feet crossing onto the ice, dragging me with him. I fought with all of my strength, scratching his hand. We moved further onto the ice, my feet dragging behind me as Ted drugged me with the strength of a gorilla. The song grew in volume, growing all the more heavenly as we approached the hands moving in frenzy, knocking against the ice. Something cracked. My mind racing, I lunged up and bit Ted's neck. He jerked suddenly and let me go. "Jesus Christ!" He turned to me, hand clamped on his neck. Then he looked around. Where a dash, the ice shattered. The hands raced upwards, grabbing Ted. His mouth made an O, and then he was gone. I ran. Somehow, someway making my way back through the woods, back to my car. It wasn't until I had gotten back into town that I stopped. Tears made my eyes red, and my hands shook. Ted's face was burned into my mind. There 1 second, gone the next. The song still plays in my head. The police questioned me to no end. I didn't tell them about the hands. They would have never believed me. Instead, I lied. Told them he ran into the woods, and I had tried to stop him. Then he drowned. His death was ruled a suicide. His parents' glares told me who they blamed. That was almost 4 months ago now. Even as I sit alone in my room, I hear the whistling. It follows me everywhere. Nothing about the story said anything about whistling, and nobody said anything about how many people went missing in those woods. I don't know what telling this will accomplish, but I'm going back out there. The whistling is calling me, and I can't resist it.